The sea before dawn was a restless animal, black and heaving beneath a slate-colored sky. Spray lashed the sides of the steel landing craft, mingling with the diesel fumes that hung thick as a storm cloud. 19-year-old Tommy Miller hunched beneath the rim of his helmet, trying to ignore the sour churn in his stomach. The Channel's cold breath seeped through every seam of his uniform and the weight of his pack, nearly 70 pounds of gear rations and ammunition pressed into his spine until it felt like a second skeleton. Around him, men shifted in uneasy silence, their boots slick with the mingled sweat and seawater sloshing across the deck. Hollywood liked to show war as a single sweeping charge, a righteous wave of men charging heroically into glory. But as the Armada crept toward the French coast on the morning of June 6, 1944, there was no glamour, only a slow, grinding dread. Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in history, was unfolding under a sky that smelled of salt and cordite. More than 5,000 ships and landing craft, bristling with soldiers, tanks, and artillery, stretched from horizon to horizon. From a distance, it looked like an endless black reef, a mechanical tide moving toward the beaches of Normandy. Tommy's landing craft bucked and pitched with each wave. Someone gagged behind him, the sound sharp and human against the drone of engines. The air reeked of vomit and fear. He clutched his M1 Garand knuckles white and tried to steady his breathing. He thought of home, of his mother's voice over Sunday breakfast, of the Missouri fields in late spring, but the memories came as distant echoes already half erased by the roar of the Channel. Above the relentless chop of the water came the thunder of naval guns. Allied battleships pounded the coastline, their shells screaming overhead like angry gods. Each concussion rattled the landing craft and sent a low vibration through Tommy's chest. Far ahead, through breaks in the mist, he caught glimpses of orange blooms along the shoreline as German fortifications absorbed the barrage. Yet he knew, as did every man aboard, that the enemy bunkers were far from broken. The Germans had spent years fortifying these cliffs and beaches, laying mines, building concrete pillboxes, and stringing barbed wire. They called it the Atlantic Wall, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had boasted that the defenses would throw any invader back into the sea. A voice cut through the wind. 5 minutes. The coxswain's shout cracked like a whip. Tommy's heart clenched. 5 minutes until the ramp dropped. 5 minutes until the world shrank to bullets and sand. The men checked their weapons in silence. Dog tags clinked softly as they moved. A few murmured prayers, their words carried off by the wind. Tommy swallowed hard and focused on the rhythmic churn of the propeller, the only sound he could cling to. The sky in the east began to pale, a smear of silver behind the heavy clouds. Dawn was coming, whether they were ready or not. From the deck's edge, he caught a glimpse of other landing craft bouncing across the waves, packed tight with soldiers just like them, faces, pale eyes wide. Every man aware that the next few minutes might be his last. Overhead squadrons of Allied aircraft thundered toward the coast, their engines weaving a steady, ominous hum into the morning air. Somewhere behind the curtain of artillery smoke lay Omaha Beach, their assigned Sector 1 of 5 invasion beaches that stretched across the Norman coast. Intelligence had warned of strong German defenses there, more formidable than at Utah or Gold. Tommy tried not to imagine what waited behind those sand dunes and concrete bunkers. Another flash of memory, his father's handshake before he boarded the troop train in St. Louis. "Keep your head down," the old man had said, voice gruff with unshed worry, "and don't you dare play hero." But heroics were for the movies. Out here, survival was the only goal. The coxswain's voice came again, closer, sharper. 2 minutes, lock and load. A metallic chorus followed as rifles were charged and safeties clicked off. Tommy's pulse hammered. He could taste salt and bile. He fixed his eyes on the steel ramp at the front of the craft, the thin sheet of metal that was all that separated them from the chaos beyond. Naval guns thundered again, a barrage that rattled teeth and bones. The sky flared with distant fire. Someone muttered a curse. Someone else crossed himself. Tommy tightened his grip on his rifle and took one last breath of the cold, diesel-soaked air. The landing craft shuddered to a stop. Chains rattled. The ramp groaned as it began to lower. A streak of dawn lit the horizon, and in that split second before the world exploded, Tommy felt the eerie calm of a man stepping off the edge of everything he had ever known. The ramp slammed down with a metallic crash, and the roar of war came flooding in a cacophony of machine gun fire, exploding shells, and the high keening whistle of bullets slicing the air. Tommy's boots splashed into icy water up to his waist. The shock of it stole his breath as if a fist had punched his chest. Around him, men staggered forward into a maelstrom of foam and fire. The English Channel moments ago, only restless now, seemed alive with fury. Spray erupted as bullets sparked against the steel hull, ricocheting like angry hornets. The landing craft behind them spewed more soldiers into the killing zone, each one silhouetted for a heartbeat before vanishing into smoke and mist. Overhead, the sky was bruised with dawn, streaked by the arcs of tracer fire that burned like molten comets. Tommy fought to move each step a battle against the weight of his gear and the frigid water tugging at his legs. Salt bit into his eyes, and the stench of diesel mingled with something darker blood and burned cordite. To his right, a young corporal cried out as a bullet found him, his body crumpling with a splash that sent a cold wave against Tommy's knees. The corporal's helmet rolled once on the surface before sinking, swallowed by the red-tinged tide. He forced himself forward, remembering the briefing cross, the surf fast, find any cover, survive. But the beach ahead was a nightmare. Obstacles littered the sand, angular steel hedgehogs meant to rip open landing craft wooden stakes topped with mines, barbed wire, glistening wet in the dim light. German artillery had turned the shoreline into a deadly geometry of traps and crossfire. Above the chaos, the deep thud of Allied naval guns answered their shells, screaming inland toward the fortified bluffs. Each concussion was a brutal heartbeat felt through the soles of his boots. Yet the German machine guns never faltered. MG-42s capable of firing over 1,000 rounds a minute cut across the water with a sound like tearing canvas, a relentless metallic roar that drowned human screams. A man to Tommy's left went under, dragged down by the sheer weight of his pack after a bullet found his shoulder. Tommy lunged instinctively, but caught only a fleeting glimpse of a pale hand before it disappeared beneath the churn. Panic clawed at him, but training or something deeper kept his legs moving. He stole a glance back. The sea behind them was thick with craft, a floating city of steel bristling with men and machines. Destroyers pounded the shore while transports funneled wave after wave of soldiers toward the same merciless gauntlet. The sheer magnitude of it defied comprehension. Over 5,000 ships, a sea of steel stretching beyond the curve of the earth. Operation Overlord was not merely an invasion. It was an industrial symphony of war, a feat of coordination so vast that even standing amid it felt unreal. Somewhere beyond, the smoke generals like Dwight D. Eisenhower and Omar Bradley watched the carnage through binoculars, their carefully drawn plans colliding with the chaos of reality. Intelligence had warned of fierce resistance at Omaha, but no paper map could capture the terror of machine gun fire skimming a few inches above the surf. Tommy stumbled on a submerged obstacle, his rifle nearly torn from his grip. He caught himself with a grunt, cold water soaking his sleeves. Around him, soldiers shouted orders, lost to the roar. A sergeant motioned frantically toward a patch of beach behind a jagged steel hedgehog, one of the few fragments of possible cover. Tommy angled toward it, lungs burning. As he neared the sand, a shell exploded nearby, sending a geyser of seawater and sand skyward. The blast knocked him to his knees, salt water flooding his mouth and ears. For a heartbeat, he saw nothing but white noise and black specks. When the ringing subsided, he crawled forward, dragging his rifle, tasting blood and grit. The beach was worse than the sea. Every foot of sand was raked by gunfire. Mortar rounds punched deep craters, spraying shards of metal and stone. Men hugged the ground like desperate creatures, clinging to any scrap of shelter, shell holes, broken obstacles, even the bodies of the fallen. Above them loomed the bluffs, dark silhouettes lined with concrete bunkers that spat fire. Tommy pressed himself against the cold steel of the hedgehog, chest heaving. Around him, the world was a haze of smoke and flame. He could smell the acrid tang of burning fuel, the unmistakable iron scent of blood. Fear throbbed through him like a second pulse. but beneath it flickered a grim resolve forward was the only direction that existed. Somewhere inland beyond the smoke and thunder lay the hedgerow country of Normandy and the first fragile steps toward liberating Europe. But here in the killing surf of Omaha Beach, that goal felt impossibly distant. For now, survival meant inching forward through the storm one breath and one heartbeat at a time. The cold sand scraped Tommy's palms as he crouched behind the jagged steel of the beach obstacle. The roar of machine guns and the hiss of bullets turned the air into a solid wall of noise. Every breath tasted of salt and iron. Men were pinned all around him, some shouting orders, others screaming in pain, many silent forever. He risked a glance toward the bluffs. Concrete bunkers hunched along the ridge like predators' muzzle flashes winking from their dark slits. German soldiers were dug in with perfect fields of fire. Each time an Allied soldier tried to sprint for better cover, the MG-42s erupted, stitching the sand with deadly precision. The weapon's shriek was unmistakable, a ripping metallic buzz that seemed to vibrate in his bones. A few yards away, an engineer squad struggled to place a Bangalore torpedo beneath the tangle of barbed wire. The long metal tubes packed with explosives were the only hope of punching a path through the obstacle belt. Bullets spat sand over their helmets as they worked their movements, frantic but disciplined. Tommy watched one man fall clutching his chest while another dragged the detonator into place. A moment later, a thunderclap split the air and a section of wire vanished in a shower of sparks and debris. The way forward was still deadly, but at least there was a gap. The sun finally broke over the channel, a pale disk behind drifting smoke. It cast a cold silver light that only made the carnage more vivid. The slick crimson of the tide, the blackened craters, the motionless bodies half buried in sand. Allied naval shells continued to hammer the bluffs, but the German guns answered with relentless discipline. Each explosion sent tremors through the beach, rattling Tommy's teeth. Move. Move, now. A sergeant's voice cut through the din, ragged with urgency. Tommy gritted his teeth and sprang from his fragile cover. Sand kicked up around his boots as bullets tore the air. He sprinted low, feeling the awful drag of his pack and the burn in his lungs. Halfway to the next crater, a mortar round struck close enough to throw him forward. He hit the ground hard, ears ringing, vision flashing white. For a heartbeat, he lay stunned, the world reduced to a high-pitched whine. Then instinct, pure survival, shoved him onward. He crawled into the shell hole, gasping, heart hammering. In that shallow crater, he found two other men, a corporal with a bloodied sleeve and a private whose face was ashen but eyes still sharp. They exchanged no words, only nods. The unspoken pact was clear: keep moving or die here. Further down the beach, another squad lobbed smoke grenades, trying to veil the German sights. Thin gray tendrils drifted across the sand, a fragile curtain between life and death. Through the haze, Tommy glimpsed the shattered remains of landing craft, their ramps twisted and blackened by fire. The first waves of the assault had been chewed apart. Of the 197 men who had launched with his company, it was already impossible to guess how many still lived. Tommy's mind flashed to the months of preparation that had led to this single morning. Operation Overlord had been planned with mathematical precision. Paratroopers dropped inland to seize bridges, naval bombardments, timed to the minute tides calculated to expose beach obstacles. And yet, standing amid the chaos, it was clear that no plan could tame the fury of war. Reports would later reveal that Allied forces would suffer over 10,000 casualties before nightfall, with more than 400 dead. But in this moment, statistics meant nothing. There was only the next breath, the next desperate scramble forward. A sudden shout from the corporal, covering fire, snapped Tommy back. Together they rose just enough to fire toward the bunkers, M1 Garand recoiling against his shoulder. The shots were little more than a gesture against the entrenched enemy, but it gave another squad the chance to dash toward a gap in the wire. Seconds later, a mortar burst rained shrapnel into their crater. The corporal slumped unmoving. Tommy swallowed the surge of panic and pressed deeper into the sand, feeling it vibrate with each explosion. Somewhere beyond the smoke, naval gunners adjusted their aim. A new volley of shells screamed overhead, detonating with earth-shaking force atop the ridge. Chunks of concrete and soil erupted skyward. For an instant, the machine guns fell silent. The private beside Tommy caught his eye and jerked his chin toward the next stretch of shattered beach. Now or never, Tommy nodded. They sprang up together and ran, legs pumping lungs, burning hearts pounding like war drums. Behind them, the sea continued to churn red, but ahead, just beyond the next line of wire, waited the bluffs of Normandy and a perilous path into German-held France. The climb from the churn of the surf to the rough slope of Omaha Beach felt like a passage through some man-made circle of hell. Every sense was assaulted, the acrid stench of cordite, the metallic tang of blood mingling with seawater, the deafening percussion of artillery that made the very sand vibrate beneath Tommy's palms. He ducked into the lee of another crater lungs dragging in air thick with smoke and salt and stared at the unyielding rise of the bluff ahead. The Germans had turned this beach into a death trap long before the first landing craft left England. Months of preparation, barbed wire woven like steel spider webs, mines hidden beneath wet sand, jagged metal hedgehogs poised to rip open the belly of any vessel that dared approach, had transformed the shoreline into a labyrinth of calculated slaughter. And now, the Atlantic Wall roared to life. From concrete bunkers cut into the hillside, the defenders poured fire down on the invaders. Machine guns barked in vicious bursts, mortars whined and crashed, and snipers waited for the smallest flicker of movement. Tommy pressed his helmet tighter against his head as a volley of bullets snapped overhead, each supersonic crack a reminder of how fragile a human body really is. Beside him, a young private struggled to reload, hands slick with blood that wasn't his own. The kid's eyes darted wildly unfocused until Tommy gripped his shoulder and forced a steadying nod. Training was the only lifeline here, and even that felt as thin as the smoke drifting across the beach. A sudden tremor rippled through the ground, a different, deeper thunder than the German guns. The Allied Navy was shifting tactics. Offshore battleships and cruisers adjusted their aim, hurling heavy shells into the bluffs with apocalyptic force. Each impact flung geysers of dirt and stone high into the sky. For a few fleeting seconds, the machine gun fire slackened. Dust and rubble cascaded down the slopes like a landslide of iron and fire. "Go move now, a sergeant!" bellowed his voice, raw but commanding. Tommy surged forward with the others, his boots sinking into sand that had turned slick with seawater and blood. The air boiled with grit and smoke. A body lay sprawled across the path, its face mercifully hidden by a helmet, and Tommy leapt over it without breaking stride. He no longer felt the weight of his pack or the ache in his legs, only the relentless drive to reach the next scrap of cover. The beach, once an awe and open killing field, was beginning to break into fragments of chaos and opportunity. Smoke from naval bombardments and hastily thrown grenades drifted in uneven veils, momentarily obscuring German sightlines. Engineers, those unsung heroes, raced to exploit these fleeting shadows crawling on their bellies to set charges on barbed wire and wooden stakes. Explosions blossomed in quick succession, tearing gaps through obstacles that had seemed impenetrable minutes before. Tommy and a small knot of survivors dove into a newly blasted trench. The earth here smelled of damp clay and gunpowder. A corporal clapped him on the back, the gesture equal parts encouragement and command. "Next push, we take the bluff," the man shouted over the din. His face was streaked with soot and determination. They didn't wait long. Another barrage from the Allied fleet roared overhead, the sound like the sky itself tearing open. When the last echo faded, the corporal waved his men forward. Tommy scrambled up the slope, fingers digging into mud slick with dew and blood. The incline felt endless, each foot of progress a gamble against gravity and gunfire. Halfway up, the Germans found their aim again. Bullets sparked against rocks and whined past helmets. A man behind Tommy cried out and slid back his fall, hidden by the smoke. Tommy forced himself not to look, every muscle focused on upward motion. Ahead, the silhouette of a pillbox loomed, its gun ports dark for a heartbeat, a gift of the naval barrage. The first grenades landed inside with a dull thump. Then came the concussive blast, followed by shouts in German. American troops surged forward, bayonets fixed, and poured into the position. Close quarters fighting erupted, brutal and intimate, the clash of rifle butts, the flash of knives, the raw sound of men locked in mortal struggle. Tommy caught a glimpse of a comrade driving his shoulder into a door smoke curling from the shattered frame. By the time he reached the bunker, the fight was nearly done. The air reeked of dust and sweat. A German soldier lay sprawled near the entrance, his rifle-abandoned eyes staring at nothing. The silence inside the pillbox was eerie after hours of relentless noise, a silence broken only by the labored breathing of exhausted men who could hardly believe they'd survived the ascent. Tommy staggered to the edge of the cliff and looked back. From this height, Omaha Beach stretched out like a vast scar between sea and sky. Landing craft still bobbed in the surf, spilling new waves of soldiers onto a shore that remained a killing ground. Smoke rose in ragged columns, and the distant rumble of naval guns continued to roll across the water. The tide itself was red now, stained by the sacrifice of thousands. For a moment, he felt the strange weight of history pressing down. Here was the turning point of a continent's fate. Young men flung into a storm of steel so that Europe might breathe free again. It was a thought too large to grasp, so he let it pass, focusing instead on the rasp of his own breath and the grit between his teeth. Behind him, officers barked orders. Teams began to fan inland, securing what they had bled to win. The first foothold in Fortress Europe had been seized, but the cost was staggering. Out of the nearly 200 men who had stormed the beach with Tommy's company, fewer than half were still able to fight. Many more lay silent in the sand below their names already written into the unforgiving ledger of war. The work was far from over. Beyond the bluffs stretched the hedgerow labyrinth of Normandy, a countryside of dense ancient earthworks and sunken lanes perfect for ambush and defense. German reinforcements waited there ready to counterattack. The invasion was only hours old, yet the Battle of Normandy would grind on for nearly 3 more months each day, demanding new courage and new sacrifices. As Tommy followed his squad inland, he cast one last glance toward the channel. The sea of steel that had carried them here was still visible in the early light, thousands of ships, a floating city of determination and hope. For a brief second, the sun broke through the haze and caught the waves in a silver blaze. It was beautiful, terrible, and unforgettable, the very image of what it cost to fight a war for the world's future. The wind at the top of the bluff whipped hard enough to sting Tommy's cheeks, but the air here tasted different, no longer briny with the sea but rich with churned earth and the acrid smoke of spent explosives. Below him, Omaha Beach stretched like a jagged wound across the French coast, the tide still carrying pieces of shattered landing craft back and forth as if unwilling to let them rest. For a heartbeat, he allowed himself to breathe, to feel the improbable fact of survival. Then the harsh bark of an officer's order snapped him back to the present. The battle was far from over. They pushed inland through the first fringe of low scrub and gnarled hedges, a squad of weary ghosts among the smoke. The earth beneath their boots was slick and treacherous, scarred by shell fire, and scattered with debris, splintered wood from obstacles, twisted wire fragments of helmets, mute evidence of the chaos behind them. Ahead loomed the next challenge, entrenched German positions that had survived the naval bombardment. The enemy, though shaken, was not broken. Machine gun fire cracked from a copse of trees barely 100 yards away. Bullets hissed through the branches, snapping twigs and peppering the ground with dirt. Tommy and his comrades dove for the nearest depression, a shallow ditch littered with roots and damp leaves. He flattened himself against the soil, heart pounding so violently he feared it might draw enemy fire all by itself. MG-42, the corporal hissed, peering over the rim, fast as a devil's sewing machine. The German weapon's fearsome reputation was well earned. Its blistering rate of fire could shred a squad in seconds. Tommy could almost feel each burst as a physical vibration in his chest. The sergeant signaled 2 riflemen to flank left while the rest laid down suppressive fire. Tommy lifted his M1 Garand, lined up a sight picture on the flash of the enemy muzzle, and squeezed off 2 shots. The weapon kicked hard, the sound sharp and clean amid the surrounding thunder. The forest answered with a violent reply bark exploding from a tree inches from his head. He ducked the splinters biting his cheek. To their right, another Allied squad was on the move, their approach masked by the growing chaos of overlapping gunfire. A grenade arced high and disappeared into the German position. A heartbeat later, a dull thud rolled through the trees, followed by a sudden silence. The sergeant gave the order to advance. Tommy rose and moved quickly, boots squelching in the damp soil, weapon ready. The trench they found was a wreck of smoke and dust, 2 German soldiers slumped amid broken branches and shattered earthworks. The encounter was brutal and brief war reduced to seconds and inches. They pressed onward, weaving through the hedgerow maze that made the Norman countryside infamous. These ancient earthen walls, centuries-old property lines, were shoulder-high and dense with roots perfect for ambushes and devilishly hard to breach. The men hacked at them with shovels and bayonets, each yard of progress a minor victory. Overhead, the sky remained a patchwork of smoke and pale morning light, occasionally ripped open by the roar of passing Allied aircraft. As they moved, the distant thunder of the beach never faded. Naval guns continued to pound inland targets, a low, relentless drumbeat that seemed to shake the very soil. Occasionally, the sharp crack of German artillery answered, and shells burst somewhere behind them, sending flocks of crows shrieking into the air. Each explosion was a reminder even past the beach, death traveled fast. They paused near a half-collapsed farmhouse, its stone walls riddled with bullet holes. Inside, a wounded paratrooper from the 101st Airborne sat propped against a beam, his leg crudely bandaged with a blood-soaked scarf. He had been dropped miles off course during the pre-dawn chaos, yet he greeted them with a weary grin. "Thought I'd have to take this whole village myself," he joked hoarsely, voice frayed but defiant. Tommy offered him a canteen while the medic checked his wound. The brief camaraderie warmed the cold edges of the morning. Stories flickered through the group, quick-clipped exchanges about scattered drops, missed rendezvous, and friends lost to the night sky. The scale of the invasion became more tangible in these fragments. Thousands of men, from paratroopers to engineers, each fighting their own private war in pockets of smoke and shadow. Moving again, they passed a field where a glider from the airborne units lay broken in the hedges, like the skeleton of some great bird. Its wooden frame creaked softly in the breeze, an eerie monument to the night's silent descent. Nearby, 2 more paratroopers joined their column, their faces streaked with mud and fatigue, but eyes sharp. They spoke of scattered units coalescing of objectives seized against impossible odds. Their presence was a quiet reassurance that the plan, imperfect and bloody, was still inching forward. By midday, Tommy's squad reached a modest ridge overlooking a patchwork of fields and stone lanes. From here, they could see the vast scale of Operation Overlord unfolding inland. Columns of men moved like dark ants across the countryside, tanks clattered along narrow roads, and smoke curled from distant villages where resistance still flared. It was a living map of war, drawn not on paper, but in motion and blood. A runner arrived with new orders pushed toward a cluster of hedgerow-enclosed farms where German forces were regrouping. The men tightened their packs and checked their ammunition. Tommy felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle into his muscles, but also a strange clarity. Fear was still there, sharp as broken glass, yet it no longer ruled him. Each step forward had become its own purpose. They advanced through the late afternoon light shadows stretching long across the fields. Occasional skirmishes erupted, a sniper's shot from a barn loft, a mortar shell lobbed from behind a hedgerow. But the Allies moved steadily, methodically, absorbing each jolt of danger into the greater rhythm of the invasion. At one point, they came upon a group of French villagers emerging cautiously from a stone cellar. Their faces carried both terror and a flicker of hope. An elderly woman pressed a loaf of bread into the sergeant's hands, murmuring a prayer of gratitude. It was a fleeting human moment amid the relentless machinery of war. As dusk approached, the sky flared orange behind the drifting smoke. The day that had begun in darkness and blood was ending with the hard-won knowledge that a foothold had been secured. Omaha Beach was no longer merely a name on a map. It was a scar carved into memory, paid for in lives and courage. Tommy stood with his squad on the edge of a hedgerow and looked back toward the distant sea. From here, the channel was a silver-blue band under the fading light, and the great armada of ships lay like a dark continent upon the water. He thought of the friends who had not made it past the surf, of the faces already lost to history. Their sacrifice felt immeasurable, yet it was only the beginning. The Battle of Normandy would stretch on for weeks through rain and mud, through countless skirmishes and full-scale engagements, until the Allies could finally break out of the hedgerow country and liberate France. Tonight, though, all that existed was the present. The smell of gunpowder and damp earth, the ache of every muscle, and the quiet understanding that they had survived a day that would echo through generations. Tommy tightened the strap on his helmet and followed the sergeant's gesture toward the next darkened lane. The night would bring its own dangers: German counterattacks, sniper fire, the endless fatigue of watch duty. But he moved with steady steps. Behind them lay a red tide and a beach that had consumed so many. Ahead lay the uncertain road to victory, each mile demanding the same courage that had carried them from the water's edge. Darkness gathered as the remnants of Tommy's company pushed deeper into the Normandy countryside. The sun's last glow bled across the horizon, casting the hedgerows in long skeletal shadows. The night smelled of churned earth, damp leaves, and the sharp metallic tang of gunfire that never quite faded. Every step forward was a negotiation between exhaustion and resolve. They had survived the beach, but the war was far from finished. The hedgerows themselves were an enemy. Centuries-old earthworks, overgrown with thick brush and gnarled roots, formed a maze of natural fortifications. Each lane was a sunken trench, each field a potential ambush. As Tommy's squad approached another tangled barrier, their sergeant raised a fist for silence. Somewhere ahead, muffled German voices carried on the breeze. They crouched low, ears straining. The enemy was close, perhaps a machine gun nest guarding the approach to a small village. The squad leader signaled to the engineers to prepare a Bangalore torpedo. Tommy watched as the men unrolled the long, pipe-shaped explosive, sliding the sections together with quiet precision. The Bangalore was a simple yet ingenious device, a metal tube packed with TNT designed to snake beneath barbed wire and detonate in a blast powerful enough to rip open a path. The engineers inched forward, their movements slow and deliberate, like hunters stalking prey. Tommy could feel the tension in the air, each breath measured against the possibility of discovery. A flare suddenly arced into the sky, bathing the field in a harsh white glow. Everyone froze. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then the flare hissed out, and darkness reclaimed the hedgerow. The sergeant whispered, "Move." The engineers slid the final section into place and clipped the detonator. They retreated quickly, faces pale but steady. Fire in the hole, one mouthed. A moment later, the earth convulsed with a violent crack. A wall of flame and dirt erupted, the shockwave pounding through Tommy's chest. The night filled with the acrid scent of burned powder and the sharp clang of shrapnel raining down. Go. They surged through the smoking gap, weapons ready. German shouts erupted on the far side, followed by a staccato burst of machine gun fire. Bullets snapped through the darkness, splintering branches and sending chips of earth into the air. Tommy dropped to one knee and fired the Garand's recoil sharp against his shoulder. Around him, muzzle flashes lit the night in brief, searing glimpses of chaos. Grenades exploded ahead, their dull thuds mixing with the sharper cracks of rifles. A German gunner fell silent after a final defiant burst. The squad advanced yard by yard, senses sharpened to a knife's edge. Each moment stretched long and thin, a string ready to snap. Finally, the hedgerow cleared, revealing a narrow lane leading toward the distant silhouette of a village steeple. They paused to catch their breath. The Bangalore torpedo had done its job, but the tension lingered like a phantom limb. Tommy wiped sweat from his brow, his hands trembling despite the cool night air. He could still feel the vibration of the blast in his bones. The sergeant crouched beside him, voice low. "Good work, boys, but don't get comfortable. We keep moving." As they advanced, Tommy's mind drifted to the larger picture he could barely comprehend. Somewhere behind them, the Allied command generals Bradley, Montgomery, and Eisenhower were already receiving fragmented reports of the landings. The massive invasion force had committed nearly 156,000 troops across 5 beaches: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, and Sword. Casualty estimates were already climbing into the thousands, a grim testament to the price of this foothold in Europe. But none of those numbers captured the individual heartbeat of a soldier crouched in a hedgerow, waiting for the next flash of gunfire. A sudden rumble echoed in the distance, deep and resonant. Artillery, the squad dropped instinctively as shells whistled overhead. Explosions blossomed in a nearby field, flinging dirt and debris into the night. Horses panicked in a distant barn, their terrified whinnies piercing the darkness. The Germans were probing, testing the Allied advance. Tommy pressed himself into the earth, heart hammering. He thought fleetingly of home, of Missouri's quiet fields and the smell of his mother's kitchen. And then, the memory dissolved in the acrid smoke. When the barrage subsided, they resumed their march. The village loomed closer, its dark rooftops outlined against the star-pricked sky. Along the way, they encountered a scattered group of paratroopers, their uniforms mud-streaked and torn. These men of the 101st Airborne had dropped hours before the seaborne assault tasked with seizing key crossroads and bridges. Many had landed far from their targets, scattered across the Norman countryside like seeds in the wind. One paratrooper, a lieutenant with grime streaking his face, offered a quick salute. "We've secured the causeway," he reported between ragged breaths. "But we're light on ammo and heavy on wounded." His words carried the fatigue of a night spent in constant skirmish. The two units exchanged quick information, sharing the thin lifeline of coordination that held the invasion together. Tommy listened with a kind of awe. These airborne troops had leapt into darkness hours before the fleet appeared on the horizon, guided only by the dim hope of linking up with forces like his. Their courage felt almost otherworldly. Together, the combined group pushed on toward the village. The road narrowed, hemmed in by towering hedgerows. Every rustle of leaves became a threat, every shadow a potential sniper. When a sudden burst of gunfire shattered the quiet, they dove for cover, returning fire toward a flicker of muzzle flash. The exchange lasted only moments before the silence returned, heavier than before. At the edge of the village, they halted. Stone houses crouched in darkness, their windows like hollow eyes. The sergeant signaled a cautious approach. Boots scuffed softly on the cobblestones, rifles raised. Somewhere a door creaked and a frightened cat darted across the square, its movement startling in the stillness. They found the enemy in a farmhouse at the far end, barricaded behind heavy shutters. The firefight was sharp and brutal. Grenades shattered the wooden door, rifles barked in the narrow space. When it was over, the room smelled of smoke and sweat, and the floor was littered with spent cartridges. A single German radio operator lay slumped against the wall, his headset dangling. Outside, the night was again eerily calm. The squad regrouped, counting heads. Losses were mercifully light this time. The sergeant glanced at the dark sky where the faint hum of Allied aircraft still pulsed like a distant heartbeat. "This village is ours," he said quietly, as though speaking to history itself. Tommy leaned against the cool stone of the farmhouse, exhaustion flooding through him. The day had begun with the roar of the surf and the certainty of death. It ended with a fragile victory carved out of mud sweat and relentless determination. The Bangalore's blast still echoed in his ears, a reminder that progress in this war came in sudden violent bursts, followed by long, silent marches through shadowed fields. Beyond the village lay miles of hedgerows, countless more skirmishes, and an enemy far from defeated. Yet tonight, under the scattered stars of Normandy, Tommy felt something new. Not triumph exactly, but a hard-won belief that the impossible could be done step by grueling step. A chill mist clung to the Normandy fields as Tommy's unit moved again before dawn, their silhouettes pale against the faint silver of the rising moon. The night had offered only a thin slice of rest, an hour or two of fitful sleep on cold ground helmets, for pillows, weapons always within reach. When orders came to push toward the next ridgeline, no one protested. Exhaustion was simply another piece of gear they all carried. The terrain ahead sloped upward in a gradual swell, crowned by a dark tangle of trees and the faint outline of stone farm buildings. Intelligence suggested German defenses nested along the ridge, a position from which enemy guns could rake the roads below and stall the Allied push inland. Capturing it meant breaking one more link in the German chain and enduring yet another climb through fire. Tommy adjusted the straps of his pack and fell in behind the sergeant. The ground underfoot was damp and uneven, the hedgerows around them crowding like ancient sentinels. Each step squelched softly in the morning dew. Overhead, distant flashes marked naval bombardments further along the coast, the low thunder rolling inland like the echo of an endless storm. The squad moved in, staggered formation weapons ready. The first hint of resistance came not from sight, but from sound. The metallic rattle of an MG-42 opening up somewhere near the crest. Bullets hissed through leaves, snapping twigs and thudding into the wet earth. Instinct drove them down into the nearest ditch. Dirt showered Tommy's helmet as he pressed flat his heart a furious drumbeat. "Contact ridgeline!" The sergeant barked, voice low but firm. He signaled for 2 men to flank left, while others laid down suppressive fire. Tommy raised his M1 Garand, squinting through the mist. Through the faint smoke, he glimpsed muzzle flashes, a quicksilver spark against the dark ridge. He exhaled and fired the rifle, kicking hard into his shoulder. Whether he hit anything, he couldn't tell. The gunfire above barely faltered. A new sound joined the chaos, the deep percussive boom of mortars. Shells exploded along the slope, flinging dirt and shards of stone skyward. One burst close enough to suck the air from Tommy's lungs, a hot breath of earth and shrapnel. The squad hugged the ground as fragments whined overhead. The sergeant signaled forward again. "We move on my mark," covering fire, then up the slope. A grenade lobbed from their flank detonated with a flash, briefly silencing the machine gun. "Go," the sergeant shouted. Tommy surged from the ditch boots, sliding in mud. The climb was steep, the soil soft beneath his weight. He planted one hand after another, using roots and rocks to pull himself upward. Around him, comrades scrambled in jagged bursts, their breaths harsh and quick. Above, German voices barked orders, followed by the hard chatter of another gun. Bullets smacked into the slope, spitting mud into their faces. Halfway up, a comrade slipped tumbling back with a grunt before regaining his footing. Tommy grabbed a jutting root and hauled himself higher, the muscles in his arms and legs burning. The smell of damp earth mixed with the acrid tang of gunpowder, an aroma he knew he'd never forget. Then, an opening. Allied artillery called in by radio from a forward observer began to pound the ridge. The sky thundered as shells screamed overhead and detonated with bone-shaking force. Dirt and stone rained down the slope. For a few precious seconds, the German guns fell silent. Now the sergeant roared. They charged, the final stretch bayonets fixed. The first German trench yawned suddenly before them, a rough cut in the ridge reinforced with logs and sandbags. Tommy leapt in, landing hard on his knees. A startled German soldier swung his rifle, but a quick shot from a comrade dropped him before he could fire. The trench erupted in chaos, close quarters combat where every movement was survival. The metallic clang of rifle butts striking helmets, the dull thud of grenades, the sharp cries in both languages. It was war stripped of distance. Tommy parried a lunging enemy with the butt of his Garand, the impact jarring through his arms. Another American soldier tackled the man, and together they went down in a tangle of limbs. The trench filled with smoke and the acrid stink of burned powder as more grenades detonated farther along. The fight compressed time. Seconds stretched and snapped like a whip. At last, silence crept in, broken only by the ragged breathing of the living. The trench was theirs. They emerged into the thin morning light atop the ridge. From this vantage point, the countryside spread out like a patchwork quilt of fields and hedgerows, dotted with the faint movement of Allied columns advancing inland. The channel shimmered faintly to the north, the great invasion fleet now a distant haze on the horizon. Tommy leaned against the scarred oak chest, heaving. Around him, the squad took stock, a few wounded, none dead, a small miracle. The sergeant keyed the radio, relaying the capture of the position. Soon, distant artillery shifted again, focusing beyond their newly won ridge. Below, a captured German dugout revealed its secrets, crates of ammunition, field rations, and a well-camouflaged observation post that had guided enemy artillery toward the beaches the day before. Destroying it would spare untold numbers of men down at Omaha. Engineers set to work without hesitation, wiring charges with calm efficiency. When the explosives roared to life, The dugout vanished in a fountain of earth and smoke. As the squad rested briefly, Tommy allowed himself to absorb the view. The ridge they had taken was small on any map, but its importance was immense. Each captured rise meant the Allies could push artillery inland, protect supply lines, and tighten the vice around German defenses in Normandy. The invasion wasn't a single overwhelming sweep. It was a relentless series of such steps, each bought with blood and grit. The sergeant approached, crouching beside him. "Good work, Miller," he said, voice gravelly but warm. "This ridge opens the road to Carentan. We hold here until reinforcements arrive." Tommy nodded, too tired for words. He thought of the men who hadn't made it past the beach, their sacrifice etched into every inch of ground gained. He thought of the families back home, of letters never sent and futures forever lost. The weight of it all pressed heavy, but beneath it flickered a quiet resolve. As the sun climbed higher, casting golden light across the Norman countryside, the squad dug in, reinforcing their hard-won position. Shovels bit into the soil with rhythmic determination. Beyond the ridge, the sounds of war persisted, distant gunfire, the occasional rumble of tanks, but here for a moment, there was only the scrape of metal on earth and the steady breathing of men who had faced the impossible and prevailed. Tommy glanced once more toward the horizon, where the faint line of the channel met the brightening sky. The memory of the killing surf at Omaha felt both immediate and impossibly distant. They had come from the sea like ghosts of iron and will, and now stood upon French soil as a spearhead of liberation. Ahead lay more ridges, more villages, more battles. But for this fleeting morning, they held the high ground, and with it the fragile hope that the tide of war had finally begun to turn. The ridge they had taken before sunrise was only the beginning of a day that refused to end. By late morning, the sky had turned a bleached blue, the sun bright but without warmth, casting long shadows across the scarred fields of Normandy. Tommy crouched in a shallow foxhole beside a splintered oak, his uniform stiff with dried mud and salt. He chewed a piece of hard biscuit, half a meal, but a feast compared to the night before, and listened to the distant rumble of artillery. Even in a lull, war never truly fell silent. Below the ridge, medics moved among the wounded with quiet urgency. The groans of injured men drifted upward, carried on the light breeze. Each cry felt heavier than the last, a reminder of the price already paid. Tommy's company had gone ashore nearly 200 strong. By the time they secured this high ground, barely half remained able to fight. The rest were dead, missing, or lying on stretchers, their faces pale beneath bloodied bandages. Numbers meant little in the chaos of combat, yet the sergeant's quick head count earlier had carved them into Tommy's mind, 87 men standing where nearly 200 had begun. He closed his eyes, the sounds of the ridge melting into memory. The first hours on Omaha Beach replayed in fragments, the shriek of bullets on water, the weight of the surf dragging men down the metallic thunder of the MG-42s. He could still taste the grit of sand in his teeth and feel the shudder of each near miss. Those memories were stitched into his muscles, now impossible to wash away. A medic passed carrying a stretcher, the sheet pulled up over a motionless face. Tommy forced himself not to look too closely, afraid of recognizing the shape beneath the canvas. War demanded a strange discipline of the heart. There would be time for grief later if later came. The sergeant approached quietly, his boots crunching in the loose soil. "Orders from battalion," he said. "We hold until reinforcements arrive, then push toward Carentan. This ridge is the key to the causeways." His voice was steady, but fatigue lined his face like chisel marks. He crouched beside Tommy, lowering his voice. "You did well down there. Don't forget it." Tommy managed a faint nod. Praise felt hollow when so many friends lay silent on the beach below, but he appreciated the attempt. He thought of Corporal Harris, who'd fallen beside the first hedgehog, of young Private Lewis, whose helmet had rolled into the surf like a toy. He remembered their jokes on the troop ship, their nervous smiles as they checked their rifles one last time. Now they were part of the sand part of the endless sea that had carried them here. Overhead, Allied aircraft droned toward the interior, their engines a low, reassuring hum. Occasionally, a squadron of P-47 Thunderbolts dipped low, strafing distant targets with the hiss of machine guns. Each pass was a promise that the invasion force still held the skies. The sight steadied Tommy's nerves. The German Luftwaffe was a rumor now, their airfields crippled by weeks of Allied bombing. At least one element of the plan had worked perfectly. As the morning stretched into afternoon, reinforcements trickled up the slope. Fresh-faced soldiers from later waves climbed the ridge with wide eyes, scanning the battlefield with a mixture of awe and dread. They carried heavier weapons, mortars, light machine guns, crates of ammunition, evidence that the beachhead below was finally secure enough for supply lines to function. Tommy watched them dig in their shovels, biting into the soil with a steady rhythm. The sound was strangely comforting, the deliberate labor of men fortifying a position bought with blood. A sudden metallic crack split the air. Everyone dropped instinctively, rifles ready, but it was only the distant boom of naval artillery pounding German strongpoints farther inland. The thunder rolled across the fields, a reminder of the vast machine of war that moved behind their small squad. Operation Overlord was a masterpiece of coordination. Battleships off the coast, paratroopers scattered through the hedgerows, engineers clearing mines, and soldiers like Tommy forming the living spearhead. But grand strategy meant little in the quiet moments. In a lull between orders, Tommy found himself staring at the horizon where the faint line of the channel shimmered like a mirage. The fleet was barely visible now, a smudge of gray on the water, but he could still imagine the countless ships that had filled the sea that morning. He pictured the men still landing on the other beaches, Utah Gold Juno soared, each facing their own private nightmare. He thought of the airborne troops who had jumped through darkness hours before dawn, some landing miles from their targets, fighting in small, desperate groups to secure bridges and roads. He had met a few of those paratroopers, already lean, mud-streaked men with stories of midnight firefights and silent kills in the hedgerows. They carried themselves with a calm born of necessity, and Tommy felt a kinship with them. All of them infantry engineers airborne, were threads in the same vast tapestry woven together by the sheer will to push inland. The afternoon sun warmed the ridge, but the warmth was thin and fleeting. Clouds of smoke still drifted from the lowlands, veiling the countryside in a gauzy haze. In the distance, occasional bursts of gunfire reminded everyone that German resistance remained fierce. Somewhere beyond those fields, enemy reinforcements were regrouping. The Battle of Normandy, they all knew, was only beginning. As dusk approached, Tommy joined a detail sent to scout a nearby hamlet. The small cluster of stone cottages lay quiet beneath the lengthening shadows. Windows were shuttered doors, closed tight. A few French villagers emerged cautiously as the Americans approached, faces lined with fear and guarded hope. An elderly woman offered a flask of cider with trembling hands. A young boy, no more than 10, saluted shyly, his eyes wide with wonder. Their gestures spoke volumes, relief, gratitude, the fragile belief that liberation had arrived. The squad moved through the hamlet, securing it without incident. A barn at the edge of town revealed a cache of German ammunition and a field radio still crackling faintly. They destroyed the equipment and left the building smoldering, a small but vital disruption to enemy communications. Tommy watched the flames lick at the timber beams, the firelight reflecting in the boy's curious eyes. For the first time that day, he felt the presence of civilians as more than shadows in the distance. These people had endured occupation for 4 long years. Their quiet courage was its own kind of defiance. Night fell quickly. Back on the ridge, stars emerged in a sky scrubbed clean by the evening breeze. The squad settled into defensive positions, digging deeper foxholes and setting sentries along the perimeter. Tommy shared a canteen with the private beside him, their conversation a few muttered words about home Missouri for Tommy, Illinois for the other soldier. The talk faded as fatigue claimed them both. From his shallow trench, Tommy looked once more toward the darkened channel. The memory of the beach lingered, the roar of the surf, the smell of diesel and blood, the endless barrage of German fire. He wondered if those sights and sounds would ever leave him, or if they were etched permanently into his mind. Perhaps that was the true price of survival, to carry the echoes of that day forever. Yet amid the exhaustion and the ache of loss, a quiet certainty settled over him. They had come ashore against impossible odds, and they still stood. The ridge was theirs. The beachhead was secure. Tomorrow, they would push further inland through the hedgerows and fields toward the liberation of an entire continent. For now, under the cold starlight of Normandy, there was only the hush of the night and the steady breathing of men who had faced death and found, if not victory, then an unbreakable resolve. While Tommy and his battered company held their ridge, a different drama unfolded miles inland under the cover of darkness. Hours before the first landing craft churned toward the beaches, the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions had leapt from the night sky in one of the most daring operations of the war. Their mission was as critical as it was dangerous: seize key bridges and causeways, cut German communications, and sow confusion deep behind enemy lines so that the men storming the beaches would not be flanked or driven back into the sea. Sergeant James Cooper of the 101st Airborne still felt the adrenaline from that jump coursing through his veins. The memory of the C-47's vibrating fuselage clung to him, the deafening drone of engines, the smell of oil and canvas, the red light that seemed to burn forever before finally blinking green. He remembered the sudden rush of cold air as the door opened to the night sky, the shouted order, "Go, go, go," and the moment his boots left the floor, plunging him into the vast darkness over occupied France. The descent was chaos and beauty fused together. Below the Normandy countryside spread out like a patchwork quilt of black fields and silver rivers. Anti-aircraft tracers clawed upward in angry orange arcs, their glow reflected in wisps of low-lying mist. Cooper gripped the lines of his parachute, the roar of the aircraft fading behind him, replaced by the whistling wind and the distant thunder of naval guns from the coast. For a brief, eerie moment, he floated in a silence so complete it felt like the world had paused. Then the ground rushed up with brutal suddenness. He hit hard, rolling to absorb the impact, the weight of 80 pounds of gear slamming into his shoulders. The field was soggy, the grass heavy with dew. Around him, the night erupted in scattered gunfire and the distant crack of explosives. Voices called out in English and German, fragments of commands and curses mixing in the dark. Cooper fumbled for the quick release buckles, freed himself from the harness, and crouched low, scanning the hedgerows. Nothing looked like the map studied in England. The drop had scattered his stick across miles, the carefully plotted landing zones dissolving into chaos. He clicked his cricket signal, two sharp metallic snaps meant to identify friend from foe. Only silence answered. Minutes passed before another click replied from the darkness. Relief washed over him. A familiar voice followed a soft Midwestern drawl. "Cooper. That you?" It was Private Wilkins, his closest friend since training at Camp Toccoa. The two clasped shoulders briefly, an unspoken promise of mutual survival. They began to move crouching low as they navigated the hedgerows. Each step forward was a negotiation with shadow. German patrols prowled the lanes, their boots striking the cobblestones with a deliberate rhythm. Twice the pair dropped flat as silhouettes passed within yards, the faint glint of bayonets catching stray moonlight. The smell of damp earth and cow manure mingled with the acrid tang of smoke from distant fires. Hours slipped by in a blur of cautious movement. They gathered stragglers as they went, a radio operator missing his handset, a medic with a hastily bandaged arm, a pair of soldiers from the 82nd who had landed nearly 5 miles off course. By twos and threes, the scattered paratroopers became a small, determined band. They whispered plans in quick bursts, voices barely audible above the rustle of leaves. Their first objective was a stone farmhouse near a key crossroads. Intelligence suggested it housed a German machine gun team guarding one of the causeways leading from Omaha Beach. As they approached, a pale dawn began to bleed into the sky, turning the mist a ghostly blue. Cooper signaled for silence, then for a flanking maneuver. The assault was swift and violent. Grenades shattered the wooden shutters. Rifles barked in the narrow hallways. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When the smoke cleared, the farmhouse was theirs, the German defenders neutralized. A radio set still crackled on a table inside, and Wilkins used it to send a terse-coded message the causeway was secure. There was no time to celebrate. Even as they regrouped, the distant rumble of heavy artillery reminded them that larger battles raged toward the coast. They moved on to the next target, a small bridge over the Murderay River skirting ditches and hedgerows, pausing only to dodge the occasional German convoy. At one point, they came upon a downed glider, its wooden frame splintered like a broken bird. Inside, 2 wounded men stirred pale but alive. A medic from Cooper's group stabilized them, leaving them hidden in the hedges with whispered promises of help. By mid-morning, their ragged team of 30 men had secured a second objective and linked up with another scattered platoon. Cooper marveled at the improbable success. They had dropped in darkness scattered across miles, and yet somehow key bridges and crossroads now flew American flags. Later reports would reveal that thousands of paratroopers were similarly dispersed, fighting dozens of small, desperate engagements that collectively crippled German response. As they paused to catch their breath near a hedgerow, Wilkins handed Cooper a dented canteen. "Think the Beach Boys made it?" he asked, voice low. Cooper thought of the naval barrage they had heard hours earlier, the distant thunder rolling across the fields. "If they didn't," he said, "we'll make damn sure they do now." They shared a moment of quiet resolve. Around them, the French countryside was waking roosters, crowed hesitantly, and thin curls of smoke rose from distant farmhouses. Liberation had begun, but its price was already steep. Cooper knew that thousands of men on the beaches in the sky and here in the hedgerows were paying for every inch of progress. As sunlight strengthened, the paratroopers dug in near the captured bridge, setting perimeter guards and preparing for counterattack. Cooper finally allowed himself a deep breath, the tension easing slightly. He thought of the long months of training, of the endless jumps from wooden towers of the instructors who had drilled into them the mantra, "The mission comes first." Now standing on enemy soil with the bridge secure, he understood the weight of those words. Beyond the hedgerows, faint booms marked the inland push of seaborne forces, perhaps men like Tommy Miller clawing their way past the beach defenses. Though separated by miles, their efforts were bound together like the strands of a single rope. The invasion was working not through any single act of heroism, but through the combined resolve of tens of thousands, each performing his duty in the face of fear. As noon approached, the paratroopers received word of advancing American infantry columns. Relief washed through the group like a quiet tide. Reinforcements meant resupply, medical aid, and a moment's rest. Yet Cooper knew their work was far from finished. The Germans would counterattack. The hedgerows would hide ambush after ambush, and the drive to liberate France would stretch on for weeks. Still, as he watched the sunlight glint off the slow-moving Murderay, he felt a fierce, steady pride. Against darkness, confusion, and overwhelming odds they had held. They had carved a foothold where none existed the night before. And as the rumble of distant Allied artillery rolled through the warm air, Sergeant James Cooper allowed himself a rare, fleeting smile. The hours after sunrise revealed just how chaotic the night's airborne landings had been. Sergeant James Cooper crouched beside a mossy hedgerow, his paratrooper boots soaked with morning dew and streaked with mud. The countryside stretched before him in a patchwork of damp fields and ancient stone lanes, beautiful in the fragile light and treacherous in every direction. He and his improvised squad of 30 men were alone in enemy territory, and though they had captured a vital bridge, their real mission had only begun. The previous night's jump had scattered the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions like seeds cast to the wind. What was meant to be a tightly coordinated drop had become a sprawling mosaic of isolated fights and desperate improvisations. Cooper's own platoon, intended to land in a concentrated zone near Sainte-Mère-Église, had instead touched down miles apart, the darkness swallowing formations and erasing plans. Some sticks drifted into flooded marshes, men drowning under the crushing weight of their gear. Others landed in trees or among German patrols fighting for their lives before their boots even touched the ground. Radios were lost or smashed on impact. Maps were useless when you didn't know where you'd fallen. Cooper looked over at Private Wilkins, who was crouched beside the captured farmhouse they now used as a temporary command post. The young paratrooper's face was lined with exhaustion, yet his eyes remained sharp. Together, they had navigated hedgerows that felt like green walls, each turn a guess. Twice during the night, they had flattened themselves against the earth. While German patrols passed within arm's reach, the metallic clink of enemy gear loud enough to raise the hairs on their necks. "Think the rest of the company's anywhere near Wilkins," whispered his voice a rasp from hours of tension. Maybe Cooper answered, but near enough to matter hard to say. "For now, we hold this bridge. Command will find us eventually." The bridge over the Merdere River stretched behind them, its stone arch now draped with hastily strung American flags cut from parachute silk. Capturing it had been no small feat. The firefight had raged through the pre-dawn gloom grenades, bursting against stone walls, tracer rounds, carving streaks across the mist, the dull thud of mortars shaking the ground. When the last German resistance broke, Cooper's men had taken a quick count: 3 wounded, none killed. In a night full of scattered chaos that felt like a miracle. As dawn strengthened, the countryside began to reveal itself more clearly. Fields of ripening wheat shimmered in the morning breeze. Cows lowed in distant pastures, seemingly unaware that a massive invasion force had arrived just beyond the horizon. The tranquility was almost surreal, like a painting overlaid with the faint percussion of distant artillery. Every so often, the ground trembled as naval guns miles away fired on German coastal batteries, their deep thunder rolling across the landscape. More paratroopers trickled in, guided by the metallic cricket clicks used for recognition in the dark. A lieutenant from the 82nd Airborne arrived with a half-dozen men, their uniforms torn and faces streaked with soot. They carried a battered radio that miraculously still worked. "We were supposed to be 6 kilometers west," the lieutenant said, shaking his head. "Got blown clean off course, but we secured a crossroads on the way, took out a machine gun nest too." Cooper allowed himself a tight grin. Then the night wasn't a waste. The newcomers shared what intelligence they'd gathered. German reinforcements were rumored to be on the move, probing for weaknesses near the causeways that connected Utah Beach to the interior. That made holding this bridge even more critical. If the enemy recaptured it, the seaborne troops landing at Utah would be vulnerable to counterattack. By mid-morning, Cooper's mixed band of soldiers' men from different units thrown together by chance had grown to nearly 50. They set up a defensive perimeter, stringing barbed wire, scavenged from the farmhouse, and positioning light machine guns to cover the approach roads. Ammunition was pooled rations divided. A medic tended to the wounded in the farmhouse kitchen, the smell of blood mingling with the faint scent of baked bread that still clung to the stone walls. Despite the exhaustion, morale lifted as the sun climbed higher. The men swapped fragments of their nightmarish journeys: a jump into a flooded orchard, a firefight in a moonlit lane, a silent knife attack on a German sentry. Each story underscored the same truth: their training and grit had turned chaos into opportunity. The enemy had expected confusion, but not this level of stubborn resilience. Around noon, a distant drone announced the arrival of Allied aircraft. A formation of P-47 Thunderbolts streaked overhead, their engines a reassuring roar. Cheers broke out among the men, brief but heartfelt. For a moment, the terror of the night receded, replaced by the knowledge that the sky, and perhaps the day, belonged to the Allies. Yet danger was never far. Scouts reported movement along the eastern hedgerows, a small German patrol perhaps probing the area. Cooper quickly organized a reconnaissance team. He and Wilkins crept through a narrow, sunken lane, rifles at the ready, senses taut as piano wire. The hedgerows loomed overhead like green walls, their dense roots forming tunnels of filtered sunlight. Each step was a measured risk, each rustle of leaves a potential ambush. They found the patrol near a stone culvert, a squad of 6 Germans' rifles slung as they surveyed the landscape. Cooper motioned silently, and his men opened fire in a coordinated burst. The firefight lasted less than a minute. When it was over, the patrol lay silent, their warning to higher command forever unsent. The Americans quickly searched the bodies for intelligence, finding maps and a radio set that confirmed enemy plans to retake the bridge. It was exactly the proof they needed to brace for an inevitable counterattack. Back at the farmhouse, Cooper relayed the information to the lieutenant from the 82nd. They reinforced the perimeter and sent runners to seek contact with other airborne units. The men ate quickly, conserving what rations remained, and checked their weapons with deliberate care. Every face carried the same grim readiness. As afternoon waned, the countryside seemed to hold its breath. Birds wheeled silently over the river. Distant gunfire ebbed and flowed like a restless tide. The men waited, nerves stretched tight, until at last the crack of rifle fire signaled the enemy's approach. Shadows moved among the hedgerows, followed by the unmistakable clatter of a machine gun. Cooper barked orders, his voice clear despite the rising din. American rifles answered in a sharp volley. Grenades arced over the hedges, blooming in smoke and shrapnel. The skirmish raged for nearly 20 minutes. German soldiers probed the defenses, but the airborne troops held firm, their crossfire disciplined and deadly. Finally, the enemy broke off, retreating into the hedgerows, with shouted orders in clipped German. The men of the 101st and 82nd exhaled as one, their shoulders sagging with relief. The bridge remained in American hands. As dusk deepened, a messenger arrived bearing the news they'd hoped for. Infantry columns from Omaha Beach were advancing inland, their vanguard only a few miles away. Reinforcements would reach them before midnight. A quiet cheer rippled through the weary paratroopers. They had held. When darkness finally returned, Cooper stood on the bridge and gazed at the river, its surface catching the faint shimmer of moonlight. He thought of the night before the leap into emptiness, the chaos of scattered landings, the near silent terror of moving through enemy territory with no clear map and no guarantee of survival. Against overwhelming odds, they had forged order from disorder and helped ensure the success of the greatest invasion in history. Beside him, Wilkins rested, his helmet on the stone railing, eyes reflecting the moonlit water. "Reckon the Beach Boys will make it through the night?" he asked softly. Cooper nodded, the sounds of distant artillery still rumbling like faraway thunder. "They already have," he said, "and so have we. My." The river flowed silently beneath them, carrying away the echoes of battle. Above, stars emerged one by one, cold and brilliant in the Normandy sky. As night deepened across the Norman countryside, the scattered paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne began to knit themselves into something resembling an organized force. Sergeant James Cooper stood in the moon-dappled lane near the captured bridge, the chill of the river creeping through his boots. Around him, tired men drifted in from the darkness in twos and threes, some bloodied, some missing equipment, all etched with the same look of wary determination. The small band that had seized the bridge at dawn had now grown to nearly 100 soldiers, a patchwork of units brought together by the simple gravity of survival. Cricket clicks, two sharp metallic snaps announced each new arrival. It was a sound Cooper had come to cherish, a small mechanical heartbeat of recognition in the dark. Each click meant another American had beaten the night. A medic crouched near a lantern, its muted glow casting long shadows as he stitched a jagged wound on a private's arm. Nearby, a lieutenant from the 82nd updated a rough map with notes from new arrivals. Lines of charcoal sketched the hedgerows, bridges, and farm lanes where firefights had flared. Though the map was crude and the information piecemeal, it represented something more important than precision. It was proof that the mission still lived. Cooper walked the perimeter boots, crunching softly in the damp soil. The night air smelled of wet leaves and faint cordite, the ghosts of earlier battles lingering like a distant storm. Every few yards he passed a sentry crouched behind a hedge or tree trunk, their rifles pointed toward the dark lanes that spiderwebbed through the countryside. They were ready for a counterattack that might come at any moment. Beyond the hedgerows lay miles of farmland and scattered villages, each field and lane a potential trap. Cooper's mind replayed the chaotic jump from the night before, the sudden rush of air, the frantic tangle of parachute cords, the heavy silence of descent broken only by the distant thump of artillery. They had leapt into uncertainty and landed in a maelstrom, but now, despite the confusion, the mission's outline had taken shape. The bridges were held, the causeways were guarded. Omaha Beach, miles to the west, was no longer isolated. Wilkins appeared from the darkness with a half smile that barely disguised his exhaustion. "More strays," he whispered. Behind him, two paratroopers emerged, their uniforms soaked and mud-caked, eyes wide with fatigue. One carried a radio wrapped in a damp poncho. From Dog Company, the taller of the two explained, "We heard the clicks. Took us all night to find you." "You found us," Cooper said, offering a brief handshake. that's what counts. The new arrivals carried grim news. A German patrol had ambushed their sticks shortly after landing. Several men were missing, perhaps captured, or worse. Cooper listened without interruption, the weight of each report adding to the silent ledger of the night. The cost of the operation was steep, and they all knew it would climb higher before dawn. Despite the fatigue, there was a strange electricity in the air, a quiet pride that they had held their ground. Around a small fire, shielded by a broken wall, men shared canteens and scraps of rations, swapping stories of near misses and narrow escapes. One paratrooper described hiding beneath a hay cart, while a German half-track rattled past its headlights, slicing through the mist. Another recounted a silent struggle with an enemy sentry, the memory etched in his eyes more vividly than words could capture. They spoke in low tones, mindful of the dark beyond the hedges. Yet their voices carried a fierce undercurrent of resolve. Each man understood that the night's confusion had not broken the mission. It had forged them into something harder, leaner, and more resourceful than any plan drawn on paper. Shortly after midnight, a runner arrived from a neighboring unit with a welcome message. The beach landings had succeeded. Allied forces were pushing inland from Utah and Omaha, their lines gradually linking with airborne positions. The invasion was holding. The men around the fire exchanged weary smiles, some closing their eyes in momentary relief. Cooper felt a tightness in his chest ease, though only slightly. The battle for Normandy had barely begun, and they all sensed it. Before dawn, a low rumble signaled approaching vehicles. The sentries stiffened rifles ready, but the silhouettes that emerged carried the distinct outline of American helmets. An infantry column from the beach had finally arrived. Mud-splattered soldiers with heavy packs trudged into the makeshift perimeter, their faces etched with the same mix of exhaustion and quiet triumph. They clasped hands with the paratroopers, brief greetings passing between men who understood without words what the last 24 hours had cost. Together, they fortified the bridge with sandbags and machine gun nests. Engineers inspected the stone arches for damage, pronouncing them sound. When an officer unrolled a larger map and began issuing fresh orders, the men leaned close eyes, intent despite their fatigue. The next phase was clear push toward the town of Carentan to link the Utah and Omaha beachheads, choking off German reinforcements and securing the critical Cotentin Peninsula. As the eastern sky paled, Cooper stepped away from the gathering to watch the first streaks of dawn filter through the mist. He thought of the men who would never see this light, the friends lost in the surf at Omaha, the paratroopers who had fallen silently in the hedgerows. Their absence was a weight that settled over him like the morning dew, heavy and inescapable. Wilkins joined him, sipping the last of his canteen water. "We made it," he said quietly. "For now," Cooper replied. He gazed at the river where a thin layer of fog curled like smoke. "This is just the beginning." The soft light revealed the landscape in gentle colors. Hedgerows beaded with dew fields still wet from the night's rain, a farmhouse chimney sending up a cautious wisp of smoke. It might have been a peaceful rural morning anywhere in the world except for the distant boom of artillery that reminded them all that war was far from over. A supply truck rumbled onto the bridge carrying crates of ammunition and food. The smell of hot coffee drifted on the cool air, almost surreal after a night of fear and gunpowder. Soldiers lined up for tin cups of the dark brew, their weary faces softening with each steaming sip. It was a small comfort, but one that rooted them to the living. Cooper accepted a cup, the heat seeping into his chilled fingers. He looked around at the men, paratroopers, infantry engineers, all of them bound by a single relentless purpose. The invasion was working because of moments like this, scattered groups who refused to surrender, who turned chaos into opportunity and confusion into victory. As the sun broke fully over the hedgerows, casting golden light on the battered farmhouse and the quiet river, Cooper felt a cautious sense of hope. They had gathered the lost, held the bridge, and prepared the path for the tide of Allied forces surging inland. Ahead lay Carentan-Saint-Lô and the long, grinding push to liberate all of France. But for this brief morning, with the fog lifting and the men sharing silent nods of recognition, the impossible had been achieved. From the chaos of scattered drops and desperate skirmishes, order and resolve had emerged, fragile, hard-won, and unbreakable. The first rays of dawn found the combined American force, paratroopers, and infantry alike ready for their next move. A pale mist clung to the Murderay River Valley, softening the jagged scars of battle. Sergeant James Cooper stood with his squad near the captured bridge, the rising sun painting the water in streaks of copper and gold. After a night of chaos, the light felt almost unreal, as if some benevolent force had decided to pause the war for a heartbeat. But the quiet was deceptive. Scouts reported scattered German units regrouping in the hedgerows, their movements masked by the same mist that now gilded the countryside. Intelligence from higher command confirmed that the enemy was already reinforcing Carentan and the surrounding villages. The mission for Cooper's mixed detachment was clear. Push eastward, seize key crossroads, and hold until the advancing infantry from Utah Beach could link up. Every hedgerow between them and Carentan could hide an ambush. The men moved out in staggered formation boots, squelching in dew-soaked grass. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke from smoldering farmhouses. Crows wheeled overhead, startled by the crunch of American boots and the faint metallic jingle of equipment. Each soldier knew that the next firefight could erupt without warning, and each step forward demanded silent courage. They encountered the first resistance at a stone farmhouse guarding a narrow lane. The German defenders, perhaps a dozen men, had positioned a light machine gun in the loft, its barrel trained on the road below. Cooper signaled for a flanking maneuver, his hand gestures crisp despite fatigue. Two riflemen crept through a drainage ditch emerging behind the barn. A grenade lobbed through the loft window shattered the quiet with a sharp crack, followed by a burst of American fire. Within minutes, the farmhouse was secured. Inside, the air smelled of smoke and plaster dust. A wooden table lay overturned papers scattered across the floor. A half-empty bottle of schnapps glinted in the pale light. Cooper ordered the men to clear each room, while a medic checked a wounded German soldier who had surrendered with trembling hands. Despite the violence, the Americans offered water and bandaged his leg. The rules of war held even amid its chaos. As they regrouped outside, a distant rumble drew their eyes to the east. A small column of German infantry was advancing along a sunken lane, likely probing for counterattack. Cooper's men swiftly set up a defensive line along the hedgerow. When the enemy came within range, the Americans opened fire in a disciplined volley. Rifles cracked, and the BAR's heavy stutter echoed through the mist. The Germans scattered, returning fire in sharp bursts, but the ambush was decisive. After a brief but fierce exchange, the survivors retreated toward the woods, leaving behind weapons and a few wounded comrades. The victory was small on the map, but immense in spirit. Every skirmish that slowed the enemy bought precious time for the main Allied forces pushing inland. Cooper allowed himself a moment to absorb the significance these isolated firefights multiplied across Normandy were weaving the fabric of success for Operation Overlord. By mid-morning, the squad pressed on toward another objective, a crossroads where two narrow lanes met near a cluster of barns. Along the way, they linked with a handful of paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne, mud-streaked and weary but eager to join the fight. Their sergeant, a wiry veteran with a sardonic grin, clasped Cooper's hand. "Heard you boys made quite a racket at that bridge," he said. "Mind if we add to the music?" "Welcome to the party," Cooper replied with a faint smile. Together, the enlarged unit advanced through the hedgerows using the dense greenery as cover. The countryside here was a maze of earthen embankments and thick roots centuries old and devilishly suited for defense. Each bend in the lane required careful scouting. A single machine gun nest hidden behind a hedge could halt an entire column. Near the crossroads, they spotted movement, a small German outpost, perhaps unaware of the Americans' approach. Cooper quickly organized a coordinated assault. Two teams crawled through parallel ditches, their uniforms slick with mud, while a third squad prepared to charge once the first shots were fired. At the signal, rifles barked and grenades erupted in sudden fury. The Germans responded with startled shouts, their return fire ragged and disorganized. Within minutes, the outpost was silent. The Americans secured the crossroads and hastily fortified it with sandbags and overturned carts. From this vantage, they could see far across the patchwork fields. To the west, faint columns of smoke marked the line of advance from Utah Beach. It was a sight both heartening and sobering. The invasion was working, but the cost was written in every plume of black rising against the sky. As the men rested and redistributed ammunition, French villagers emerged from hiding. An elderly farmer approached cautiously, a white handkerchief raised in tentative greeting. Behind him, a young woman carried a basket of bread, her eyes wide with both relief and lingering fear. Through halting French and broken English, they offered what help they could, water, a few precious eggs, and whispered warnings of German patrols still roaming the woods. One of the paratroopers, fluent in French, translated their gratitude. They say, "Thank you for coming." The words were simple, but the emotion behind them was profound. For these villagers, the arrival of American soldiers meant the first real hope of liberation after 4 years of occupation. Cooper accepted a piece of bread, its crust warm despite the morning chill. He tasted the quiet defiance of people who had endured years of darkness and now dared to believe in freedom. "Tell them," he said to the translator, "that we're not stopping. We'll see this through." The squad remained at the crossroads until midday, watching for any sign of enemy counterattack. Occasional rifle shots echoed from distant hedgerows, but no organized force appeared. Overhead, the growl of Allied aircraft became a near-constant presence. P-47s and Spitfires streaked across the sky, their silver bellies flashing in the sun, a moving reminder that the skies belong to the Allies. By early afternoon, fresh orders arrived. Hold the position until reinforcements from Utah Beach reached them. The men settled into a rhythm of vigilance, digging deeper foxholes, laying out fields of fire, and sharing what food and water they could spare. Some took brief naps in the shade of the hedges, rifles cradled like lifelines. Cooper walked the perimeter, speaking quietly to each sentry. He offered words of encouragement, checked ammunition, and listened for concerns. The soldiers responded with nods and weary smiles. They were tired to the bone, but their resolve was unbroken. In a rare lull, Cooper allowed himself to think of home, the quiet streets of his Midwestern town, the smell of fresh-cut grass after a summer rain, his mother's voice calling him in for supper. These memories felt distant and fragile, like postcards from another life. Yet, they grounded him, a reminder of what all this sacrifice was for. Late in the day, the distant rumble of artillery signaled the approach of friendly forces. Soon, the first armored vehicles from Utah Beach appeared on the western road, their silhouettes blurred by heat haze. A cheer rose from the men at the crossroads, a low, exhausted but unmistakably triumphant sound. Reinforcements meant relief, resupply, and the knowledge that the foothold in Normandy was secure. As the sun began to set, painting the fields in shades of amber and crimson, Cooper stood atop the hedgerow and watched the converging columns of Allied troops. The invasion that had begun in darkness and terror was now a living momentum, unstoppable and immense. From the beaches to the hedgerows, from scattered paratroopers to coordinated assaults, the plan was working. He felt Wilkins step beside him, both men silent as they took in the view. The countryside still bore the scars of battle, but it also shimmered with the promise of liberation. Cooper thought of the men who would never see this sunset and felt a quiet resolve settle over him like the evening mist. "This is just the start," Wilkins said softly. Cooper nodded. "But it's a damn good start." Behind them, the crossroads buzzed with the movement of soldiers, the clang of equipment, and the low hum of engines. An orchestra of progress. Ahead lay Carentan-Saint-Lô and the long march toward Paris. But tonight, as the first stars pricked the darkening sky, the men of the 101st Airborne and their newfound brothers in arms had earned a moment of rest and the knowledge that their first victories would echo across a continent. By the time the sun sank low over the Norman countryside, the beachheads were no longer tenuous lines on a map. They were living, breathing strongholds. From Utah in the west to Sword in the east, the Allied landings had not only survived the day, but begun to fuse into a single expanding front. The soft evening light bathed the hedgerows in gold as American, British, and Canadian forces pressed steadily inland. What had started as a gamble across the channel was becoming a foothold on the European continent. For Sergeant James Cooper and the mixed band of paratroopers and infantry at the crossroads, the arrival of reinforcements was both relief and rallying cry. Columns of weary soldiers streamed in from Utah Beach, men with sand still clinging to their boots, eyes reddened from smoke and fatigue, yet carrying an unmistakable energy. Their presence meant the causeways to the coast were secure supply lines established and the German grip on the region beginning to weaken. Cooper greeted a captain leading one of the fresh companies. The officer's uniform was mud-streaked, but his handshake firm. "Good work holding this position," the captain said, surveying the fortified hedgerows and the captured bridge beyond. "You made the link-up possible." It was the men, Cooper replied simply. Praise felt hollow when he thought of the dozens still missing their fates unknown in the dark fields and flooded marshes. But he accepted the acknowledgement with a nod. Around them, soldiers exchanged quick words, offered canteens, and shared rations. The camaraderie of survival bridged ranks and regiments. As darkness settled, distant artillery rumbled like an approaching storm. The Germans had not vanished. They were regrouping. Patrols reported enemy units digging in around Carentan, intent on holding the town that controlled the road between Utah and Omaha beaches. Securing it would be the next crucial step, and everyone knew it. Orders filtered down for an early morning advance. The men prepared in silence, checking rifles, distributing ammunition, and studying maps by the dim glow of shuttered lanterns. While others worked, Cooper walked a short distance to a low ridge. From there, he could see the faint shimmer of the channel far to the north, a silver ribbon under a sky spattered with stars. The armada that had delivered them was still visible as tiny pinpoints of light. Only a day earlier, those ships had seemed impossibly large, an iron wall stretching to the horizon. Now they were quiet guardians, their guns still thundering in support of the inland fight. The enormity of what had happened began to settle in. Historians would later record that over 156,000 Allied troops had crossed the channel on D-Day, supported by nearly 7,000 naval vessels and 11,000 aircraft. They would note the 10,000 casualties, the thousands dead on both sides, the logistical genius that made the invasion possible. But standing there in the cool night air, Cooper felt those numbers as something far more intimate. Every statistic, a heartbeat, every victory, a face, every loss, a silence that could never be filled. A soft rustle behind him announced Private Wilkins. The younger soldier held 2 tin cups of the bitter coffee that had somehow found its way forward. "Thought you could use this," Wilkins said, offering one with a faint smile. Cooper accepted it gratefully. The steam curled in the moonlight, carrying the scent of burned chicory and metal. They stood together silent, sipping slowly. After a while, Wilkins spoke. "You think the folks back home will understand what this was like?" Cooper exhaled the question heavier than the rifle on his shoulder. "Maybe they don't have to," he said at last. "Maybe it's enough that we were here and that we did what we came to do." Below them, the Allied camp settled into a restless quiet. Soldiers slept in shallow foxholes or leaned against hedgerows, their breath misting in the chill. Medics moved softly among the wounded, and the occasional cough or murmured word punctuated the darkness. Overhead, Allied aircraft droned toward deeper targets in occupied France, their engines a steady reminder that the war stretched far beyond these fields. Just before midnight, a messenger arrived with a written update from higher command. The note confirmed that British and Canadian forces had secured their own beaches and were pressing inland toward Cannes. American units at Omaha and Utah were consolidating their gains, and the link-up of the 2 U.S. sectors was now a primary objective. Carentan is the key, the message concluded. Hold the crossroads. Prepare to advance at dawn. The words crystallized what everyone already sensed. D-Day was not a single triumph, but the opening act of a brutal campaign. The hedgerow country ahead promised weeks of grinding combat. The Germans would fight fiercely to contain the Allied breakout, using every hedge and stone wall as a fortress. Victory would demand endurance as much as courage. Cooper returned to his position near the bridge and checked on the sentries. Their silhouettes merged with the hedges' rifles angled toward the dark lanes beyond. Each man gave a quiet nod as he passed a silent acknowledgement of shared purpose. In their faces, he saw the same mixture of exhaustion and resolve that defined the entire invasion force. As the night deepened, he lay back against the cool earth and let his thoughts drift. He pictured the men who had jumped with him, those who had not yet reappeared, and those who never would. He remembered the frantic descent from the C-47, the hiss of tracer rounds, the sudden stillness of the landing. He thought too of the soldiers who had faced the killing surf at Omaha and Utah, the endless climb from the blood-red tide to the smoking bluffs. Different battles, one immense struggle. Somewhere beyond the hedgerows, Tommy Miller and his battered company were surely digging in, holding ground won at unimaginable cost. Cooper imagined their foxholes damp with dew, their minds haunted by the roar of the sea and the scream of shells. Though they had never met, their stories were threads of the same fabric. Together, these countless acts of endurance and defiance were shaping the fate of Europe. The eastern sky was paling when the first orders for the Carentan advance came down. Men roused themselves with weary efficiency, stretching stiff muscles and checking weapons. The smell of brewed coffee and damp soil filled the cool air. Cooper stood rolling his shoulders to shake off the night's chill and scanned the quiet fields. A thin fog hugged the hedgerows, turning the dawn light to silver. "Time to move," Wilkins said, tightening the straps on his pack. Cooper nodded. "Let's finish what we started." As the column formed and began its cautious march toward Carentan, the first sunbeams broke over the eastern horizon. They bathed the hedgerows in gold and lit the distant channel with a soft glow, as if nature itself were acknowledging the day's wait. Behind them, the sea that had delivered an army now shimmered like a promise kept. The invasion of Europe was no longer a daring plan on a briefing map. It was here, in the mud under their boots, in the smoke rising from the villages, in the quiet determination of thousands of soldiers moving as one. The foothold was real, and with every step inland, the Allies were prying open the door to liberation. Cooper tightened his grip on his rifle and followed the column into the misty lanes. Around him, the steady tramp of boots became a single heartbeat, a rhythm that seemed to carry the hopes of millions. Ahead lay Carentan-Saint-Lô and the long road to Paris. The campaign for Normandy was only beginning, but the hardest part, the leap across the channel and the first desperate fight to stay, was already behind them. And so they marched, a living testament to the day the tide of war finally turned. Morning broke over Normandy with a pale gold light that caught the edges of the hedgerows and turned the dew to diamonds. From the newly secured crossroads, Sergeant James Cooper and his men could see the long ribbon of Allied strength stretching back toward the coast columns of infantry, rumbling tanks, supply trucks, groaning under crates of ammunition and rations. What had begun as a desperate gamble the previous dawn was now a solid breathing front. The invasion of Europe was no longer a vision whispered in planning rooms, it was fact. Reports filtered through the ranks as the troops prepared for the day's push. British forces were pressing inland from gold and sword beaches, fighting house to house in the approaches to Caen. Canadians from Juneau had linked arms with their British counterparts and were driving toward Carpiquet Airfield. At Omaha and Utah, American units were expanding their hold, fortifying supply routes, and funneling reinforcements ashore. The great machine of Operation Overlord 5 beaches, nearly 7,000 naval vessels, over 150,000 troops was in motion, and the German defenders were reeling. Yet for the soldiers on the ground, the victory was far from complete. The Normandy campaign would stretch across nearly 3 more months of brutal grinding combat. Ahead lay Carentan-Saint-Lô and the maze-like bocage country where every hedgerow hid potential ambushes. The Allies would endure mud rain and relentless counterattacks before finally breaking out toward Paris in late summer. D-Day was the opening chapter, not the conclusion. As Cooper's column advanced, the signs of hard-won progress were everywhere. Convoys of engineers repaired shattered roads, medics escorted long lines of wounded toward field hospitals hastily set up near the coast. French civilians stepped cautiously from cellars and barns, some clutching small flags that had been hidden since the dark days of occupation. Children waved shyly at the passing troops, their eyes reflecting both wonder and the lingering fear of war's shadow. In one liberated hamlet, a middle-aged baker offered warm bread still fragrant from his oven. "Pour la liberté," he said softly, "for freedom." The soldiers accepted with quiet gratitude, each bite a reminder of the human stakes behind the mission. Liberation was not an abstract goal. It was written in the faces of these villagers who had endured 4 years of Nazi rule. Farther inland, Cooper spotted an American flag draped over a farmhouse window, its colors bright against the stone walls. He paused for a moment, feeling the weight of history settle around him. Every mile gained meant another family released from tyranny, another step toward the collapse of a regime built on fear. The sacrifice of thousands on the beaches and in the hedgerows was giving Europe a chance to breathe again. Meanwhile, back near the coast, survivors of the initial beach landings, men like young Tommy Miller, were consolidating positions, digging in against expected counterstrikes. Tommy's company, which had charged through the bloodied surf of Omaha, now held a critical ridgeline overlooking the approaches to Carentan. Of the nearly 200 who had stormed the shore, fewer than half remained fit for duty. Yet they worked with quiet determination, fortifying trenches and sharing stories of the day that had felt like a lifetime. Tommy himself carried memories that would never fade, the cold weight of the channel pulling at his legs, the scream of machine gun fire slicing through the dawn, the sight of friends falling one after another in the crimson tide. Those images were etched into him like carvings in stone. But so too was the realization that they had done the impossible. They had taken the beach, climbed the bluffs, and helped open the door to freedom. The scale of the effort remained staggering. Historians would later record that by nightfall of June 6, 1944, Allied forces suffered more than 10,000 casualties, including over 400 dead, while German losses ranged between 4,000 and 9,000. Yet these numbers only hinted at the personal courage that carried men through the storm of steel. Each statistic concealed countless acts of bravery: a medic dragging a wounded comrade from the surf, an engineer wiring explosives under relentless fire, a paratrooper holding a bridge with dwindling ammunition until reinforcements arrived. As the days passed, these individual struggles merged into a single unstoppable tide. Allied forces pushed through the bocage, slowly outflanking German strongpoints. Town by town, they liberated villages where church bells rang for the first time in years. In late July, Operation Cobra would finally break the stalemate, allowing American armored divisions to surge across France. By August, Paris would be free. The invasion that began with a perilous crossing of the Channel would end with the liberation of an entire nation. For Cooper Wilkins, Tommy, and tens of thousands of others, the journey ahead remained perilous. They would face mortar fire in hedgerows, sniper bullets in narrow streets, and the grinding fatigue of continuous combat. Yet the memory of D-Day, of leaping from a plane into darkness, of wading through a sea, turned red, of standing shoulder to shoulder against overwhelming fire, would remain a source of strength. They had proven that courage could outmatch fear, that ordinary men could shape the course of history. One quiet evening weeks later, Cooper found himself again near the Murderay River Bridge, where his unit had first held against the night. The water flowed, as it had that morning after the jump silver in the moonlight, carrying away the echoes of gunfire. He thought of the friends who would never see their homes again, of the countless sacrifices etched into the soil of Normandy. The war was not yet over, but the outcome had shifted irrevocably. Europe's liberation had begun here in these fields, and on those beaches, bought with sweat and blood. Back on Omaha's bluffs, Tommy would later write in a brief letter to his family, "The sea was red, the air was fire, and yet we moved forward. I don't know why I survived when so many didn't, but we did what we had to do. We kept moving." His words captured the essence of the day more than any official communique ever could. The legacy of June 6, 1944 endures not only in history books, but in the quiet freedoms of everyday life. It lives in the laughter of liberated children, in the steady hum of a peaceful Europe, and in the enduring alliance forged among nations that dared to challenge tyranny. D-Day was not merely a battle. It was a declaration of human resolve, a testament to the belief that even the darkest night can give way to dawn. As the summer of 1944 unfolded, the men who had braved the Channel carried forward with that belief burning within them. Their path would wind through France into Belgium, and eventually across the Rhine into the heart of Germany. Some would fall along the way, others would return home changed forever. but all of them would remain bound by the memory of that single day when the tide of war turned, when the world witnessed what courage, unity, and sacrifice could achieve. For those who survived the sounds of D-Day, never completely faded the whistle of shells, the crash of surf, the shouted commands swallowed by the wind. Yet with time, those echoes mingled with something softer. The bells of liberated towns, the laughter of families, reunited the gentle rush of a free people's everyday life. And so the story of D-Day concludes not with a single victory, but with the enduring truth it revealed that when ordinary men and women stand together against oppression, even the strongest fortress can fall.